The elevator doors opened on the 41st floor, and James Carter stepped out into a lobby that cost more than he'd made in the last 3 years combined. Marble floors, veined like something alive. A chandelier shaped like a falling star, frozen mid-drop above the reception desk. A wall of glass overlooking the city, so clean it looked like there was no glass at all, just the skyline hanging in the air. James was 38 years old, wearing a grey work jacket with his name stitched slightly crooked over the pocket, because he'd sewn it on himself the night before his daughter's school play, when he hadn't had time to get it done right. He carried a black folder under his arm. Inside it were 11 pages of measurements, photographs, and one sentence, underlined twice, that he had written and rewritten until his hand cramped at 11 o'clock the night before. The east support columns on floors 12 through 15 are showing stress fractures inconsistent with the load rating. Recommend immediate closure and inspection before Friday's event. He had 40 minutes before doors opened for the Meridian Tower launch gala. 600 guests. Reporters from 4 major outlets. A mayor who owed the company nothing and would smile for cameras anyway. A skyline view that would end up on the cover of every business magazine in the country by Monday morning. And somewhere in the middle of all that shine, a crack in the concrete that nobody wanted to look at. Mr. Carter. A young assistant in a headset waved him toward a glass-walled office at the end of the floor, her voice carrying the practiced cheer of someone paid to keep everything moving on schedule. She has 4 minutes before the pre-event walkthrough. Please make it fast. James nodded once, adjusted the folder under his arm, and walked forward. His boots were quiet on the marble, out of place among the click of expensive heels moving in every direction around him. Florists carrying centerpieces, a sound technician trailing cable, 2 publicists arguing softly about seating charts. He passed a wall of framed photographs on his way, decades of Hale Dynamics history, groundbreakings, and ribbon cuttings, a black and white shot of an older man in a hard hat shaking hands with a much younger mayor, the words Robert Hale, founder engraved on a small brass plate beneath it. James paused for half a second in front of it, the way he paused in front of most things worth noticing, then kept walking. He had learned a long time ago that buildings remembered the people who built them a lot longer than boardrooms ever did. Victoria Hale was standing behind her desk with her back to the door, phone against her ear, watching the sun drop behind the skyline like she owned that too. She was 30 years old, and she had been CEO of Hale Dynamics for exactly 14 months, ever since her father's heart gave out in a boardroom he had built with his own hands, on a Tuesday morning, mid-sentence, in front of 11 people who would never fully explain to her afterward what his last words had actually been. She had inherited the company. Tonight, in front of 600 witnesses, she intended to prove she hadn't just inherited it, she had earned it. Tell the caterer if the champagne isn't chilled by 6, I'll find someone who can chill it, she said into the phone, then ended the call without a goodbye and turned. She looked at James the way people look at a delivery that arrived at the wrong address, holding the wrong box, standing in the wrong doorway. You're the inspector, she said. Not a question. James Carter. Structural consultant. I did the pre-launch survey on the East Wing yesterday, and a follow-up walk this morning. And? He opened the folder and set it on her desk, turning it so the photographs faced her, close-up shots of hairline cracking along a support column, a level reading beside a tape measure, a comparison photo from the original engineering report beside his own. There's cracking along 3 of the primary support columns. Floors 12 through 15. The pattern doesn't match normal settling. Settling cracks run diagonal and shallow. These run vertical and deep, and they're spreading faster than they should for a building this age. I want to be wrong about this, Ms. Hale. I really do. But I've seen this exact stress pattern one time before, on a parking structure outside Columbus. It was flagged, dismissed as cosmetic, and it partially collapsed 9 days later. 3 people were hurt. It could have been worse. Victoria didn't sit down. She didn't even fully turn her body toward the folder on her desk. She glanced at the photographs the way someone glances at junk mail on their way to something more important. You want to shut down my launch? Tonight. In front of 600 guests and every business reporter on the East Coast, 4 hours before doors open. I want you to postpone the observation floor portion of the event. 12 hours. Enough time for an independent structural engineer to confirm or rule this out. Do you have any idea what tonight means for this company? For this city? We announced this launch 8 months ago. The mayor rearranged his schedule. 3 television crews are already setting up outside. I have an idea what it means if that ceiling comes down on 600 people. Something flickered behind her eyes. Not fear yet. Something closer to irritation, the particular irritation of a person who has spent 14 months proving she belongs somewhere, being told by a stranger in a work jacket that the ground beneath that proof might not be solid. My father built this tower, she said, each word measured, controlled. Structural engineers signed off on every floor. City inspectors signed off. This building passed 3 separate reviews before we ever broke ground on the observation deck. And now, 4 hours before the biggest night of my career, a contractor I've never met, who I hired on a 2-day pre-launch contract, wants me to cancel everything because of 11 pages and some photographs taken with a phone. I'm not asking you to cancel anything. I'm asking you to wait 12 hours before 200 people stand on floor 14. We don't have 12 hours, Mr. Carter. James kept his voice level. He had learned a long time ago, in rooms far less polished than this one, that raising his voice never made anyone listen, it only made them stop. With respect. Somebody has to be the one who says the uncomfortable thing before it becomes an emergency. Tonight, that's me. I'm not trying to embarrass you or your company. I'm trying to make sure this is the last time anyone has to think about it. Victoria walked to the door and opened it herself, a gesture that said more clearly than any words could that the conversation was already over. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Carter. Security will show you out. Ms. Hale, please, just read the full report before tonight. I built my entire reputation this year on not flinching, she said, and for 1 second, just one, her voice cracked in a place she probably didn't know still existed. I am not flinching tonight. Not for a contractor. Not for anyone. James looked at her for a long moment. He thought about saying more. He thought about the 11 pages in the folder, about the parking structure outside Columbus, about the sound concrete makes right before it finally lets go. Not a bang, but a long, low groan, like something ancient waking up in pain after being ignored for far too long. Instead, he picked up the folder, buttoned his jacket, and said the only thing he had left. I'll leave a copy with your facilities office on my way out. If anything changes tonight, anything at all, you have my number on the cover page. He walked out past the assistant, past the marble, past the chandelier shaped like a falling star, and rode the elevator down alone, watching the floor numbers tick past. 41, 30, 22, 14. Pausing half a second longer than the rest on the number 14, though he couldn't have said why. Behind him, through the glass, Victoria Hale straightened her blazer, checked her watch, and went back to being the person 600 guests were about to applaud in less than 4 hours. Neither of them said it out loud, but they both felt it, in different ways, for different reasons, the kind of silence that comes right before something breaks. On his way out, James stopped at the facilities office on the ground floor, exactly as he'd promised. A young man behind the desk, headset still looped around his neck, took the folder from him with a distracted nod, already half-focused on a call about ice sculptures melting faster than expected in the heat of the lobby lights. Make sure this gets to the safety officer on duty tonight, James said. Not just filed. Read. Sure thing, the young man said, setting the folder on top of a stack of catering invoices without looking at it. The way people set down things they've been told matter but don't yet understand why. James lingered a second longer than he needed to. The way he always did when he was leaving something important behind and couldn't shake the feeling that leaving it wasn't enough. Then he walked out through the revolving doors into the evening air, past a line of black town cars already idling at the curb for guests who hadn't arrived yet, and got into his own truck, a decade old, a dent in the tailgate from a job 3 years back, nothing at all like the cars lined up beside it. He sat there for a moment with his hands on the wheel, not turning the key, watching the tower's windows catch the last orange light of the day. Somewhere above him, on a floor he could no longer see from the street, a fracture he had photographed 20 hours earlier was still doing exactly what fractures do when nobody stops them. Quietly, patiently, getting worse. 3 years earlier, James Carter had been something else entirely. He had been a senior structural engineer at one of the largest firms in the state, The kind of job where his signature on a blueprint meant a building would still be standing in 100 years, long after the people who'd argued over its budget were gone. He had a wife, Sarah, and a daughter, Lily, who was 6 years old and thought her father could fix anything, because as far as she knew, he always had: the broken swing set, the leaking faucet, the stuffed rabbit's torn ear, the world. Then came the Meridian Tower project. James found the same kind of cracking he would later find in Meridian Tower. Smaller then, earlier, easier to fix, cheaper to fix, if anyone had wanted to. He flagged it in writing, the way he flagged everything, because a spoken warning could be denied and a written one couldn't. His firm's biggest client didn't want to hear it 3 weeks before their own grand opening. James refused to sign off on the final inspection. He was overruled by a senior partner who had known him for 11 years and still looked him in the eye and said the words cost of doing business like they meant something. Then James was quietly pushed out. No dramatic firing, just a restructuring, a severance check, a box of his things left outside his old office door, and then blacklisted by name in an industry small enough that everyone eventually heard the story, even if they never heard his side of it. Whistleblower. Difficult. Not a team player. The words followed him from firm to firm like a smell he couldn't wash off. 6 months later, Sarah was diagnosed with an illness that took 18 months to explain itself and 4 more to take her completely. James spent those 2 years doing overnight inspection work: parking structures, warehouses, strip malls, anything that paid in cash or a same-week check and let him leave in time to make Lily's breakfast. While sitting beside a hospital bed at night, holding a hand that got lighter every week, memorizing the sound of a heart monitor the way he used to memorize load-bearing calculations. Because some part of him kept thinking that if he just paid close enough attention, he could catch the failure before it happened. He couldn't. Some things don't send you a warning in time. There was one night, near the end, when Sarah had asked him, half awake, half somewhere else already, whether he regretted Brightline, the report, the job, all of it. James had thought about lying to make it easier for her to rest. He didn't. No, he'd told her, holding her hand carefully. The way you hold something you're afraid of breaking further. I'd do it again tomorrow. I just wish it hadn't cost us anything to do it right. She'd squeezed his hand, weaker than it used to be but still unmistakably hers, and said the only thing he ever let himself really lean on afterward: it didn't cost us the important part. You're still you. Don't let them talk you out of that after I'm gone. He hadn't. Some nights it was the only thing keeping him upright. He never told anyone at his new, smaller jobs who he used to be. Nobody asked. To the crews he worked with now, he was just the quiet guy with the flashlight and the clipboard, the one who checked twice and never rushed, the one who said give me 10 more minutes more than anyone liked, the one who ate lunch alone in his truck with the radio off because silence was easier than conversation most days. His daughter was 9 now. She still thought he could fix anything. He let her keep thinking that, even on the nights he came home and sat in his truck in the driveway for 10 minutes before going inside, because some days the weight of being the only parent left in the house was heavier than any beam he'd ever inspected, heavier than anything with a load rating printed on it. That morning, before Meridian Tower, Lily had made him breakfast. Cereal, badly poured, milk running off the edge of the bowl onto the counter, and handed him a drawing before he left for the day. It was the two of them standing next to a tall building, holding hands, with a son in the corner that had a smiling, lopsided face. "You're the guy who checks if buildings are safe," she'd said proudly, like she was announcing a superhero's job title to a room full of people, even though it was just the two of them in a small kitchen with the radio playing quietly. "That's the best job. Better than a doctor. Doctors fix people after. You fix it before." "It's a pretty good job," James had agreed, folding the drawing carefully along its old creases and putting it in his jacket pocket, right over his heart, the way he did with every drawing she gave him, a habit that had started the week after Sarah's funeral and never stopped. He hadn't planned on needing it for courage 12 hours later. But there it was, folded against his chest, while a 30-year-old CEO told security to show him the door in front of an assistant who wouldn't meet his eyes on the way out, embarrassed on his behalf. He wasn't angry walking out of that office. He'd been dismissed before, by bigger names, in bigger rooms, by people with more letters after their names than Victoria Hale had. What stayed with him wasn't her rejection. It was the 11 pages still sitting in a facilities office on the wrong floor, in a stack of catering invoices and seating charts, and the 600 people who had no idea a stranger had already tried to save them once and been turned away at the door. He drove home the long way, past his old firm's building, a habit he'd never quite broken, and thought, not for the first time, about how strange it was that the industry that once called him difficult for telling the truth had never once called him wrong. There was a version of James Carter that still existed only in a locked drawer in his bedroom dresser, old business cards with a title he no longer held, a photograph of himself in a hard hat standing beside Sarah at a ribbon cutting for a hospital wing he'd designed the bones of, a letter of recommendation from a mentor who had since retired and stopped answering his calls, embarrassed, James suspected, by association. He didn't look in that drawer often. He didn't need to. He carried the important parts of that life with him regardless, the discipline of checking twice, the refusal to round a measurement in a client's favor, the quiet certainty that a building was a promise made to strangers who would never know his name, and that the promise mattered more than whether anyone remembered who kept it. Lily had asked him once, not long after Sarah passed, why he didn't work at the big building company anymore, the one whose logo she still recognized on billboards around the city. He'd told her, carefully, in words a 7-year-old could hold on to without being frightened by them, that sometimes grown-ups have to choose between being comfortable and being honest, and that he'd chosen honest, and that he hoped, when she grew up, she'd understand why that mattered more than the alternative. She'd nodded seriously, the way she nodded at most things he told her, and gone back to her drawing, and he'd never been sure how much of it had actually landed until, years later, standing in a stairwell with a stress fracture widening above his head, he found himself thinking of her nod again, and of how much he needed it to have landed after all. By 7 o'clock, Meridian Tower was lit up like a promise the city had been waiting 8 months to see kept. Guests in evening wear moved through the lobby beneath that chandelier shaped like a falling star. A string quartet played near the elevators, working through something classical and unobtrusive, the kind of music meant to be felt rather than noticed. Waiters carried trays of champagne between conversations about quarterly earnings and city zoning and how remarkable it was that Victoria Hale, only 30 years old, had pulled off something her own father's board once said out loud, in a closed-door meeting, would take a decade to finish, and she had done it in 14 months. Victoria stood at the center of it in a black dress the color of the night outside the windows, shaking hands, laughing at the right moments, thanking the mayor for coming twice in the span of 10 minutes because she couldn't remember if she'd already said it, and glancing occasionally toward the elevator banks that led up to floors 12 through 15. The floors where 200 of tonight's guests would soon be standing for the ceremonial ribbon cutting on the observation deck, the crown jewel of the whole project, the image that would run on every front page tomorrow. Gerald Whitfield, chairman of the board and the last man in that room who remembered Victoria as a girl doing homework in the corner of her father's office while grown men argued about permits, found her near the champagne table just after 7:15. Facilities mentioned a contractor came by earlier, Gerald said quietly, close enough that only she could hear him over the quartet. Something about the east columns. He left a report. It's handled, Victoria said, not quite meeting his eyes, reaching for a glass of champagne she didn't actually want. Handled how, exactly? He was wrong, Gerald. Every engineer who's touched this building over the last 3 years signed off. I'm not going to let one contractor with a phone camera turn into a headline that costs us $400 million in market cap on the night we finally prove ourselves. Gerald studied her for a moment, the same slow, careful look he used to give her father whenever he suspected a decision was being made out of pride instead of judgment, a look Victoria had seen aimed at other people her whole life and was only now, for the first time, feeling aimed squarely at her. Your father used to say the fastest way to lose everything was to be right about being unafraid, Gerald said. Unafraid isn't the same thing as right, Victoria. It never was, not even for him. My father isn't here. No, Gerald said gently, and something in his voice made her look at him properly for the first time that night. He isn't. Which means the decision is entirely yours. All of it. Near the back of the lobby, away from the champagne and the quartet, Diane Torres stood with her phone in hand, quietly reading through a summary email that had landed in her inbox an hour earlier. A brief note from facilities forwarding James Carter's report for awareness, the kind of email sent more to cover a department than to actually be read. She'd glanced at the photographs, frowned slightly, and typed a reply asking whether it had been addressed, only to receive a short response from an assistant. Handled. Proceeding as planned. She hadn't pushed further. It was, she would tell herself many times over the following weeks, the single decision of that entire night she regretted most. Not because she could have stopped what happened, but because she had been close enough to ask one more question, and hadn't. At 7:40, the elevators began carrying guests up to the observation deck for the ribbon cutting. Victoria rode up with the mayor and 2 board members, smiling, one hand resting lightly on the polished railing, feeling the tower hum quietly beneath her feet the way it always had. Solid, permanent, hers, the way it had felt every single time she'd walked through it since construction finished. She had no way of knowing that 4 floors below her, in a support column encased behind drywall and expensive marble veneer, a hairline fracture that had been widening slowly for 6 weeks had just crossed a threshold it could not come back from. Structures don't announce the moment they fail. They simply stop pretending they haven't already begun to. At 7:52, the first light fixture on floor 14 flickered, so briefly that the 3 people standing beneath it assumed it was nothing, a loose bulb, a power fluctuation from the extra lighting rigs brought in for the cameras. At 7:53, a maintenance worker named Mike Reyes, running a final check near the east stairwell before the crowd arrived, felt something under his boots that he would later describe, more than once, to more than one reporter, as the floor breathing. A subtle shift, gone almost before he registered it, the kind of thing a person only notices if they've spent 20 years learning to notice exactly that kind of thing. At 7:55, 300 feet below, in his truck in the parking garage across the street, James Carter, who had left the building an hour earlier but couldn't make himself drive all the way home, who had circled the block twice telling himself he was being paranoid, felt his phone buzz against the dashboard. It was Mike Reyes. They'd worked together on and off for 6 years, on jobs neither of them ever talked about at dinner parties because neither of them had much of a social life left to talk about them at. "James," Mike said, and his voice had a shake in it James hadn't heard since a scaffolding collapse outside Trenton 4 years back that had put 2 men in the hospital. "You need to get back in here. Now. Something's wrong." James was already pulling his keys from the ignition before Mike finished the sentence, phone wedged between his shoulder and his ear. "Where are you exactly?" "East stairwell, floor 14 access." "James, I called it in to the front desk already. They said it's not on their checklist tonight. Some kind of scheduling override for the event. Nobody's coming. I'm 3 minutes out. Do not go up to that floor alone. Wait for me at the loading dock." "There isn't time to wait, man, the ribbon cutting's about to start. There's 200 people already lined up near that stage. Then meet me at the stairwell door. Don't wait outside. Go." James hung up and was out of the truck before the call fully ended, badge already in hand, moving faster than he had any right to move in dress shoes he'd worn to the earlier meeting and never changed out of. Somewhere behind him, oblivious, the string quartet in the lobby had shifted into something livelier, a piece meant to signal the evening was building toward its centerpiece, unaware that its centerpiece had already begun quietly failing 4 floors above their heads. James was through the loading dock in under 2 minutes, badge from the earlier inspection still clipped to his jacket, the folded drawing from Lily still tucked against his heart like a promise he intended to keep. Mike met him by the service stairwell, flashlight already in hand, sweat on his forehead despite the air conditioning humming steadily overhead. "Floor 14, Mike said, talking fast. The way people talk when adrenaline has already made the decision their mouth is just now catching up to. Lights flickered. Then I felt vibration through the stairwell rail, not big, but wrong. Nobody else noticed. The band's too loud upstairs and the champagne's already working on people. But I felt it. 20 years doing this, you learn what floors are supposed to feel like. How many people are up there right now? 200, maybe closer to 220. Ribbon cuttings in 8 minutes. They're already lining up near the stage." James didn't hesitate. He'd spent 2 years training himself not to, in a hospital hallway where hesitation had never once bought him anything but more time to be afraid. He took the stairs 2 at a time, flashlight cutting through the dim service corridor, straight to the column access panel he'd photographed the day before, the same panel Victoria Hale had glanced at for less than 4 seconds behind her desk. He pulled the panel free with a screwdriver from his back pocket. The fracture had grown. What had been a hairline crack 20 hours earlier was now a visible seam, dark and jagged, running nearly the full width of the column, with a thin trickle of fine concrete dust sifting down like snow that shouldn't exist indoors, collecting in a pale line along the base of the wall. James's stomach dropped in a way it hadn't dropped since a doctor sat him down in a small, too bright room and used the word months instead of years. He grabbed the radio clipped to Mike's belt without asking. "This is James Carter, structural consultant. Badge 4412. I need building security and event staff on Channel 2, right now. We have a critical structural failure in progress on floor 14, east column. I need that observation floor evacuated immediately, calm and orderly, west stairwell." Silence on the radio for 3 full seconds. An eternity when concrete is failing above your head and 200 people are laughing at a stage 3 floors up, entirely unaware. Then a voice, young, uncertain, clearly reading from some kind of protocol in his head. "Sir, we don't have authorization to interrupt the ceremony without event coordination approval. Ms. Hale's office would need to sign off on. There is no time for approval. Get security to that floor. Tell them to walk, not run, walk, so there's no panic, toward the west stairwell. That is a direct safety order. Do it now." "Copy," the voice said, still hesitant, clearly weighing a job description against something bigger than a job description. Attempting contact with Ms. Hale's office. "Belay that," James said, cutting back in. "Don't wait on contact. Send security to the floor now. Tell them to start moving the crowd toward the exits before the ribbon cutting starts, and radio the DJ or sound tech to keep the music going so it doesn't spook anyone into running. I will take full responsibility for this call. Write my badge number down if you need to. Just move." A different voice cut in, older, steadier, a senior security supervisor who had clearly been listening the whole time. "Copy that. Teams moving. West stairwell, floor 14, on my mark." "Thank you," James said, already breathing easier by a fraction, though not by much. James clenched his jaw and looked at Mike, already moving toward the east stairwell himself. "They're going to spend 4 minutes asking permission to save 200 lives, he said. "We don't have 4 minutes, Mike. Maybe we don't even have 2. He was already moving up the east stairwell, the one closest to the ribbon-cutting stage, the one nobody would think to evacuate through first because it wasn't the nice exit, it was the grey, unglamorous service stairwell, exactly where 200 lives were about to need to go regardless of how it looked on camera. Above him, unaware, Victoria Hale stepped up to a small podium in front of a wall of television cameras, took a pair of golden scissors from an aide's outstretched hands, and smiled the smile she had practiced in a bathroom mirror the night before, timing it, adjusting it, making sure it looked like relief instead of exhaustion. 14 months ago, she began, voice carrying clean and confident through the sound system. I made a promise to this city, and to a board that wasn't sure I could keep it. The chandelier above the observation deck, smaller than the lobbies, but built from the same design, the same falling star shape, trembled almost imperceptibly, a fine shiver running through its crystal arms. Nobody in the crowd noticed. Nobody but one man on the stairs below them, running, and one maintenance worker 2 steps behind him. Both of them counting seconds neither wanted to say out loud. James took the last flight of stairs 3 at a time, lungs burning, the folded drawing in his jacket pocket pressing flat against his chest with every stride, and thought, absurdly, of 100 small mornings, Lily pouring cereal badly, the ordinary weight of a life that had nothing to do with concrete or columns or load ratings, all of it compressed suddenly into the next 90 seconds, into whether 200 strangers upstairs would get to go home to mornings of their own. He didn't have time to be afraid in any complicated way. Fear, for him, had become simple a long time ago. It was just information, the same as a crack in a wall, telling him exactly what to do next. Behind the stage door, he could hear the crowd's applause rising for something Victoria had just said, warm and unsuspecting, and for one brief, terrible second he hesitated with his hand on the handle, wondering if he was about to become the man who ruined the best night of a stranger's career for nothing. Then he remembered the dust sifting from the ceiling like snow, and pushed the door open anyway. James burst through the service door onto the observation floor exactly as Victoria reached the line in her speech about a tower that would outlast every one of us in this room. He didn't care about the cameras. He didn't care about 600, no, 200 people up here specifically, who would later see the video of what happened next 100 times online, replayed in slow motion, dissected in comment sections by strangers who hadn't been there. He walked straight across the polished floor, past stunned security guards who recognized his badge from the afternoon walkthrough but had no established protocol for a man sprinting through a black tie event, and stopped at the edge of the small stage, chest heaving, dust already on his shoulders from the stairwell. "Ms. Hale. I need this floor cleared. Now." The room didn't go silent right away. A ripple of confused, nervous laughter moved through the back rows, the kind of laugh people give when they don't yet understand what they're watching, when their brains are still trying to file the interruption under part of the show. Victoria's smile didn't move, but her eyes did, sharp, furious, humiliated in front of the mayor, in front of 4 camera crews, in front of 11 board members watching from the front row with expressions she would remember for the rest of her career, whatever shape that career ended up taking after tonight. "Mr. Carter, this is not the time, look at me," James said, quiet, but carrying, the way a voice carries when a person has stopped worrying about how they sound and started worrying only about what happens in the next 90 seconds. "The column behind that east wall has failed. Not cracked. Failed. You have minutes, not hours. I am asking you, in front of everyone in this room, to evacuate this floor calmly, through the west stairwell, starting now." Somewhere near the back, a man in a tailored suit muttered to his date, loud enough to carry, "Is this some kind of publicity stunt?" It was Gerald Whitfield who moved first. 68 years old, chairman of a board that had built half the skyline visible through the windows behind him, and the only person in that room who had known James Carter's name before tonight, because Gerald had quietly read the full 11-page report an hour earlier, sitting alone in his car in the parking garage, unable to shake the feeling that something about it was true even after Victoria told him it was handled. Gerald stood up, chair scraping softly against polished concrete. "Everyone," he said, loud enough to carry across the room, calm enough not to trigger panic in 200 people who had spent the evening drinking champagne in heels. "Please make your way to the west stairwell in an orderly fashion. Leave your belongings where they are. This way, please, follow the security staff." For one terrible second, nobody moved. 200 instincts caught between trusting a stranger in a work jacket covered in dust and trusting the polished young woman who had built the tower they were standing in, whose name was on the invitation in their pocket. Then the chandelier above the stage, the smaller sibling of the one in the lobby, shifted 2 inches to the left with a sound like a wine glass cracking in slow motion, a high, thin note that cut clean through the confusion. That was all it took. The room moved as one. Not a stampede. James had asked for calm, and Gerald's steady, familiar voice held it together. But a fast, urgent tide of evening wear and heels and reporters clutching cameras to their chests, funneling toward the west stairwell while security guards, finally understanding the gravity of what was happening, waved people forward with both arms, shouting directions over the growing murmur of alarm. Victoria stood frozen at the podium for 3 full seconds, golden scissors still in her hand, watching her launch, her proof, her inheritance, her whole 14 months of trying to be enough for a room full of people who'd known her father, dissolve into chaos in front of every camera in the city. James didn't wait for her to move on her own. He walked straight to her, took her gently but firmly by the arm, and said the only words he had left in him. "You can be angry with me tomorrow. Right now, you need to walk." For a half-second she resisted, some final instinct telling her that CEOs don't get led off their own stage. Then she looked at his face, not angry, not smug, just afraid, plainly and honestly afraid, in a way she hadn't let herself be afraid all night, and she walked. They moved together through the emptying room, past overturned champagne flutes and abandoned handbags, past a photographer still reflexively firing off shots of the chandelier trembling above the stage, its crystal arms catching the light in flashes that would end up, by morning, as the single most shared image of the entire night. Victoria didn't look back once. James did, twice, checking the ceiling the way he always checked everything twice, until the stairwell door swung shut behind the last of them and cut the sound of the room away completely. The evacuation took 6 minutes. It felt, to everyone in it, like 60. James stayed until the last guest cleared the stairwell, then went back, Against every instinct that told him to leave, against the memory of a hospital room where he'd once been powerless to stop something from breaking no matter how closely he watched. Because Mike Reyes was still on floor 14, alone, trying to manually override the elevator bank so no one below would accidentally call a car up into a floor that might not hold its weight much longer. Mike. Out. Now. Elevator override stuck. I've got maybe 30 more seconds on this panel. Leave it. It's not worth your life, Mike. The floor groaned beneath them, a long, low sound, exactly the one James remembered from Columbus, exactly the one he had hoped, in some quiet corner of himself, never to hear again. Fine dust sifted from the ceiling tiles like a slow grey rain. A support beam near the stage let out a sharp metallic shriek, protest more than warning. James grabbed Mike by the collar of his uniform and hauled him bodily toward the stairwell door. They made it through with less than a foot to spare before a section of false ceiling near the stage buckled and came down in a slow, grinding collapse. Not the full catastrophic failure James had feared when he first saw the fracture, but enough. Enough to prove every single word in his 11-page report. Enough that if 200 people had still been standing there, laughing, holding champagne, at least a dozen of them would not have walked out of that room the same way they'd walked in. Down on the street, among 200 people in evening wear standing on the sidewalk in the warm night air, phones already filming, sirens already approaching from 3 directions, Victoria Hale stood very still, staring up at the tower with her father's name still lit in gold letters above the entrance, and understood, completely, for the first time in 14 months, that she had almost let pride kill the very people she had spent her whole career trying to prove herself worthy of. James walked out of the loading dock a few minutes later, Mike beside him, both of them covered in a fine layer of concrete dust that made them look, under the streetlights, like ghosts of the men they'd been an hour earlier. Victoria crossed the sidewalk toward him, weaving between reporters who were already trying to reach her, ignoring every one of them. Cameras turned. Reporters leaned in, microphones extended. She didn't seem to notice any of them. "How did you know?" she asked. Her voice had lost every ounce of the Polish it carried an hour earlier at the podium. "I didn't know," James said quietly, still catching his breath. "I was afraid." "That's different. Fear made me check twice, and check again tonight when I couldn't make myself drive home. Pride almost made you not check at all." She didn't answer. She looked, for a moment, like the girl Gerald Whitfield remembered doing homework in her father's office, young, and suddenly, painfully aware of how much she still had left to learn about the job she'd been so sure she'd already mastered. James reached into his jacket pocket without thinking and felt the folded drawing there. Lily's drawing, the two of them holding hands beside a tall building under a smiling sun. He didn't take it out. He just held his hand over it for a second. The way some people hold a hand over their chest when something inside finally settles. Then he turned, walked to his truck parked 2 blocks away, and drove home to relieve the babysitter. Because it was 9:40 on a school night, and somewhere across the city, a 9-year-old girl was waiting up past her bedtime to ask her dad if the building had been safe. The babysitter, a college student from 2 houses down, met him at the door with wide eyes and her phone already turned toward him. The video paused mid-frame on his own face. "Mr. Carter, is that you? It's everywhere already." He didn't have the energy to answer her properly, just nodded, paid her, and thanked her for staying late. Lily was curled on the couch in her pajamas, fighting sleep, a book open and forgotten in her lap. She sat up the moment she heard his key in the door, and didn't ask about the video, didn't ask about the news, didn't ask anything at all except the one question she always asked, the only one that had ever really mattered to either of them. "Did you check it good?" James sat down beside her, still smelling faintly of concrete dust, and pulled her into his side. "I checked it good, kiddo," he said. "Go to sleep. I've got you." By sunrise, the video had 11 million views. CEO ignores warning. Contractor evacuates gala minutes before partial collapse. The headlines read, one after another, across every outlet that had once been invited to cover a very different story that night. Someone in the crowd had captured the whole thing on their phone, James walking calmly onto the stage, dust on his shoulders, the chandelier shifting on its cable, Gerald Whitfield standing to lead the room out, the ceiling coming down on 200 empty folding chairs 4 minutes and 11 seconds later, the timestamp burned permanently into the corner of the footage. By 8 a.m., Hale Dynamics stock had dropped 11% in pre-market trading. By 9, 3 major investors had called an emergency session, unannounced, unscheduled. By 10, the full board, all 11 members, including Gerald Whitfield, were seated around a long glass table in a conference room that suddenly felt much smaller than it had felt the day before, when it had only ever held celebrations. Victoria sat at the head of it, dressed in the same grey suit she used to wear when she sat in on her father's board meetings as a teenager, taking notes nobody had asked her to take, a habit she'd apparently returned to without noticing. "I want to be very clear about something," Gerald said, opening the meeting before Victoria could speak, before anyone could reach for blame that wasn't theirs to give away. Every person at this table saw a summary of that report before last night's event. It sat in a facilities inbox for 6 hours because nobody wanted to be the person who suggested the launch should wait. That failure doesn't belong to one contractor working a 2-day contract. It belongs to this table. All of it. A murmur moved through the room, the particular, uncomfortable murmur that happens when powerful people are asked to share blame instead of quietly assigning it elsewhere. "The independent structural firm confirmed it at 6 this morning," Victoria said, her voice steady, though her hands were folded tightly enough on the glass table that her knuckles had gone pale. "Exactly what Mr. Carter documented. Down to the individual column numbers. If those 200 people had still been standing on that floor when the ceiling came down." She stopped. She didn't finish the sentence. Nobody in the room needed her to. "We need him," said Diane Torres, the youngest board member besides Victoria herself, still scrolling through her phone where the video was climbing past 12 million. "Public sentiment isn't angry that a building had a flaw. Buildings have flaws sometimes, that's engineering, that's understandable. They're angry that a documented warning was ignored by the person in charge. The only way this company survives the next month with any credibility is if the person who was right stands next to the person who was wrong, publicly, and they fix it together, in front of everyone." "He was fired from the structural engineering industry 3 years ago," another board member said, reading from something on his tablet. "Blacklisted. Effectively. Whistleblower situation at another firm, Meridian Tower." "He was right about that too," Gerald said quietly, and the room went still around him. "That's usually how blacklists work, when you look closely enough." "I read the coverage from back then," Diane said, still holding her phone. "There's an old quote from a partner at his old firm, calling him a talented engineer who couldn't let things go. I looked up what happened to that firm since. They lost a major contract 2 years later over a different structural issue on a different project. Nobody ever asked if maybe the problem wasn't that he couldn't let things go. Maybe the problem was that everyone around him could." Nobody at the table had an answer for that. Gerald simply nodded once, slowly, the closest thing to agreement he allowed himself in a room this tense. "There's also the matter of what we tell the public today," said a board member near the far end of the table, a man named Whitcomb who had spent the morning fielding calls from nervous investors. "An apology alone won't hold the stock. We need a plan, not just a feeling." "We'll have both," Victoria said. "But the feeling comes first. If people believe the apology is only strategy, they'll see through it in a week. If they believe it's true, the strategy has something solid to stand on." Victoria sat very still, looking at her own hands on the glass table, remembering the exact words she had said to a man in a grey jacket less than 20 hours earlier. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Carter. Security will show you out." "I need to call him," she said finally, looking up at all 11 of them. "Not for a press statement. Not for the company. For me." "Victoria," Gerald started, not to stop her, but because he wanted to hear her finish the thought. "I know what it looks like, Gerald. I know it looks like I'm doing this because the cameras are watching now, because 11 million people have an opinion about my company. I'm not doing it for the cameras." She looked around the table, and for the first time in 14 months as CEO, her voice didn't sound like she was performing confidence for an audience. It sounded, plainly, like someone who actually meant every word she was saying. I built my entire first year proving I wasn't just my father's daughter riding out his name. And in doing that, I stopped listening to the one thing he told me, more than once, mattered more than certainty ever would. What's that? Diane asked, setting her phone down. That the smartest person in any room is usually the quietest one, because they're the only one who's actually still checking their work while everyone else is busy being sure of themselves. Gerald leaned back in his chair, studying her the way he hadn't studied her in months, not since before her father's funeral. Your father would have made this call slower, he said. He would have waited a week, consulted 3 lawyers, and made sure the apology looked exactly right before he gave it. You're about to do it in an afternoon, imperfectly, because it's true. I think that might actually be better. Victoria didn't answer right away. She simply closed the folder in front of her, stood, and asked her assistant to get her a private line, away from the boardroom, away from the cameras gathering outside on the sidewalk below, waiting for a statement that hadn't been written yet and, as far as she was concerned, wasn't going to be written at all, only spoken, honestly, to one person, before anyone else heard it. James was in his kitchen when his phone rang, 7 o'clock that evening, Lily doing homework at the counter beside him. The cereal box still out from breakfast because neither of them had gotten around to putting it away in the strange, exhausted stretch of hours since the night before. He almost didn't answer. He didn't recognize the number, and after a day like the one before, he wasn't in the mood for reporters, 3 of whom had already called his cell phone, his old firm's front desk that had no idea how to reach him, and even his mother's landline 2 states away, confusing and frightening her before she understood he was safe. He answered on the 4th ring. Mr. Carter. It's Victoria Hale. James set down the dish towel in his hand. Lily looked up from her homework, curious at the sudden change in her father's posture. The particular stillness he got when something mattered, the same stillness he'd had the day a doctor first said the word diagnosis into a phone very much like this one. Ms. Hale. I'm not calling with a prepared statement, and there's no lawyer on this line. I'm calling alone, from my apartment, because I've spent the last 22 hours trying to figure out how to say something I've genuinely never had to say before in my life, and I still don't think I've gotten it right, so I'm just going to say it badly. A pause. He could hear her breathing, unsteady, on the other end of the line, none of the polish from the podium left in it. I was wrong. Not just about the column. About you. I looked at a man in a work jacket carrying 11 pages of careful evidence, and instead of seeing an expert who had done exactly the job I hired him to do, I saw an inconvenience standing between me and a good night. That's on me. That will always be on me, no matter how this ends. James was quiet for a moment. Lily was watching him now, fully, homework entirely forgotten, sensing without understanding the words that something important was happening in her kitchen. 200 people almost didn't walk out of that building last night because I was more scared of looking uncertain in front of a room than I was of actually being wrong, Victoria continued. You weren't scared of that. You walked in not caring how any of it looked on camera. I've never met anyone like that in this industry, Mr. Carter. Most people worry more about looking wrong in front of others than they worry about actually being wrong. I've had practice, James said quietly. Being the person nobody wants to hear from. I know about Meridian Tower, Victoria said. I had someone on my team look into your record this morning, first thing, before the board meeting. You were right there too, years ago. And it cost you everything, your position, your reputation in an industry that decided it was easier to blame the messenger than fix what he found. James glanced at Lily, who was still watching him closely, and thought carefully about how to answer that question in front of his daughter. How to explain to a 9-year-old that sometimes doing the right thing costs you a career, a title, a paycheck that would have made things easier, and you do it anyway. Because the alternative is a version of yourself you couldn't live inside of. And because you have to be able to look at your own child at the end of every day and know you'd make the exact same choice again without hesitating. It cost me a job title, James said finally, choosing his words the way he chose everything, slowly and on purpose. Not the same thing as everything, Ms. Hale. Not even close. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that James wondered if the call had dropped. I'd like to offer you a position, Victoria said at last. Not a contract. Not a 2-day consulting gig. Head of Structural Safety for Hale Dynamics, full independent authority, reporting directly to the board, to Gerald, and to me personally. Final say on any launch, any opening, any ribbon cutting we ever hold again, until you say it's safe. Not until it's convenient for a press schedule. Until it's actually safe. James looked down at his daughter's homework spread across the counter, a worksheet on fractions, half finished, a pencil chewed at the eraser and the way she always chewed pencils when she was thinking hard about something. There's a condition, he said. Name it. Anything reasonable. You attend the safety briefings yourself, every one of them, in person. Not because I don't trust your own engineers to do their jobs well. Because the person signing off on 600 lives, or 200, or even 2, should never again be someone who's never actually stood in the room and heard the warning firsthand from the person who found it. Another pause, longer this time, considering. Agreed, Victoria said, and for the first time since she'd introduced herself as CEO in a glass office with a view of the whole city, her voice sounded like it belonged to someone who genuinely intended to keep her word, whatever it cost her. I'll need a few days, James said. I've got a daughter, a school schedule, a life I built carefully around not depending on anyone else. I don't say yes to things quickly anymore. Not since the last time I did. Take the week, Victoria said. Take 2, if you need them. I'm not going anywhere, and neither is the offer. After he hung up, James sat at the kitchen counter for a long time, phone still in his hand, listening to Lily's breathing even out down the hallway where he'd carried her to bed 20 minutes earlier. Fractions worksheet finally finished and left on the counter beside a half-eaten bowl of cereal. He thought about Sarah, about what she would have said, and decided, after a while, that he already knew. She would have told him to stop being so careful with a life that had already survived the worst thing that could happen to it. 2 weeks later, Hale Dynamics held a second event. Smaller, no chandeliers, no golden scissors, no 600 guests in evening wear. Just a modest press conference in a conference room, cameras set up along the back wall, Gerald Whitfield and the full board seated to one side in plain chairs instead of the glass table. Victoria stood at a simple podium. No note cards this time. Beside her, in a suit that fit him a little too formally, but standing straight and steady, hands folded in front of him the way he used to stand when presenting findings to firms that no longer employed him, was James Carter. 3 weeks ago, Victoria began, her voice carrying clearly through the small room. A man walked into my office and told me something I did not want to hear. I dismissed him, and I did it quickly, because it was easier than sitting with what he was saying. Hours later, that same man walked back into a building I had personally told him to leave, and personally evacuated 200 people from a floor that partially collapsed 4 minutes and 11 seconds after he cleared it. I have watched that timestamp more times than I can count. She turned slightly toward James, and continued. I've spent every day since that night asking myself why it took a near catastrophe for me to listen to an expert instead of my own ego. I don't have a clean answer for that. What I do have is a decision. Starting today, Hale Dynamics has a new position, permanently, written into our operating charter. Head of Structural Safety, with full independent authority over every project we build, present and future. That position belongs to James Carter, a man this industry once tried quietly to erase for doing exactly what he did for us 3 weeks ago. Telling the truth, calmly, even when nobody in the room wanted to hear it. A reporter in the second row raised a hand. Mr. Carter, do you have anything you'd like to say to Ms. Hale, or to this board, after being turned away the night of the gala? James stepped slightly toward the microphone. He hadn't planned a speech. He never did. Planned speeches were for people who needed to sound sure of something they weren't. I don't need an apology, he said. I got one anyway, given honestly, and I appreciated it more than she probably knows even now. What I'd rather talk about is this. I spent 3 years being told, quietly, by an entire industry, that the smart thing to do was stay quiet, keep my head down, stop being the guy who ruins the party with bad news. My daughter is 9 years old. She thinks my job is checking if buildings are safe. She told me, just this morning while I was tying my tie, that she thinks that's the best job in the world. His voice caught, just slightly, and he let it, because there was no reason left to hide it in front of anyone. I'd like her to keep thinking that for as long as she can. I'd like every kid whose parent does this kind of quiet, unglamorous work to grow up believing that telling an uncomfortable truth is worth more, in the end, than being liked in the moment it's spoken. That's the only thing I'd want anyone to take away from any of this. In the back of the room, Gerald Whitfield, who had stood up in a room full of panic 3 weeks earlier and trusted a stranger's warning over his own instinct to stay seated and wait for official confirmation, wiped his eyes without any attempt to hide it from the cameras behind him. Diane Torres, seated at the board table, leaned toward the microphone in front of her own seat. For what it's worth, she added, unprompted, the board has also voted unanimously to fund an independent, ongoing structural review of every Hale Dynamics property currently in operation, led by Mr. Carter's team, with results made public regardless of what they find. We'd rather find our own cracks than have someone else find them for us. The room, for the first time in weeks, felt something close to relieved. Outside, on the sidewalk, a small crowd had gathered near the doors, not reporters this time, but employees, dozens of them, who had asked their managers if they could step away for 20 minutes to watch the announcement live on their phones. When James and Victoria walked out together afterward, no cameras trailing this time, one of them, a woman from the facilities department who had once been the one to file his ignored report under a stack of catering invoices, stepped forward and simply said, "Thank you for coming back." James didn't fully know how to answer that. He settled for a nod, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that it was enough. 6 months later, James stood at the base of the rebuilt observation floor of Meridian Tower, reinforced, re-engineered, inspected 4 separate times by 3 different independent firms before Victoria would allow a single guest through the doors again, a policy she had insisted on personally, over the objections of a marketing team eager to move faster. Lily stood beside him, 9 going on 10 now, wearing a small hard hat 2 sizes too big that the construction crew had given her as a joke months earlier and that she now refused to take off in public, insisting it was part of her official uniform. "Is it safe now, Dad?" she asked, the same question she'd asked him on 100 nights before this one, in 100 different kitchens and hospital hallways, and now, finally, in the lobby of the building that had made both their names known to the whole city. "It's safe," James said, crouching slightly to her height. "Because this time, everybody who needed to check it, checked it. Twice. And then a 3rd time, just to be sure." He straightened up and looked around the rebuilt observation floor, new columns wider than the originals, a redesigned support structure visible in places behind reinforced glass panels, almost like a museum exhibit, a decision Victoria had made deliberately so that no future visitor could ever again mistake strength for something hidden. Mike Reyes was there too, off to one side, now officially James's second-in-command on the safety team, running a hand along a beam with the same careful attention he'd once used to check a floor that hadn't held. Victoria approached from the elevator bank, no entourage trailing her this time, no golden scissors, just a plain folder tucked under her arm, a habit she'd picked up, she'd joked to him once over coffee, from watching him carry his own folder into her office all those months ago, back when she still thought a folder full of evidence was something to be dismissed rather than trusted. "Mr. Carter. And this must be the world's youngest structural inspector," she said, crouching slightly to Lily's height with an ease that surprised even her. Lily looked her over seriously, the way she looked over everything her father taught her to look over carefully. "Are you the CEO who didn't listen to my dad?" Victoria didn't flinch, and didn't look away, the way she once might have, months and a whole different version of herself ago. "I am. It's the biggest mistake I've ever made in my life, and probably the single best lesson I've ever learned from anyone." "He's really good at his job," Lily said, matter of fact, the way only a 9-year-old can be about something she knows to be true down to her bones. "You should listen to him next time." "Every time, actually." "I plan to," Victoria said, and meant it completely. "Every time, for as long as he'll let me." She stood, and turned to James. "The board wants to name the new safety wing after someone. I nominated you, formally, in writing. You said no. I still want to understand why, if you're willing to tell me." James glanced down at Lily, who was already wandering a few careful steps away to examine a support column with the intense, quiet focus of someone who had clearly inherited her father's habits without ever being taught them directly. "Because it was never about my name going up on a wall," he said. It was about somebody being willing to say the hard thing out loud before it became a headline nobody could undo. If you want to put something permanent on a wall, put that instead. Not mine. Victoria considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly, and made a small note inside the folder under her arm. Gerald Whitfield joined them a few minutes later, walking slower than he used to, leaning slightly on a cane he'd started using that spring, though nothing about his handshake had softened with it. He shook James's hand first, then crouched, with visible effort, to shake Lily's as well, which she took with the same seriousness she gave every adult who treated her like she mattered. You know, Gerald said, straightening back up with a small grunt, I've sat on this board for 26 years. Watched this company get built by a man who never once, in all that time, said the words I was wrong out loud in a room full of people. It took his daughter 14 months to learn how, and about 90 seconds on a stage to prove she meant it. I'd call that progress. I'd call it overdue, Victoria said, but she was smiling when she said it, the kind of smile that didn't need to be practiced in a mirror the night before. Mike Reyes wandered over from the far column, wiping his hands on a rag from his back pocket. Structure's clean, he reported. Every joint within tolerance, every weld double inspected. First building I've ever worked on where I actually believe the paperwork matches the concrete. That's the whole point, James said. Paperwork's only worth something if somebody's willing to walk it up 41 floors and say it out loud, even when nobody wants to hear it. Mike grinned, tired but genuine. Guess that's your department now. Guess it is, James said, and for the first time in a long while, the words didn't feel like a burden he was carrying alone. They felt, oddly, like something closer to home. The plaque that went up in the lobby of Meridian Tower 3 weeks later didn't carry James Carter's name at all. It read, simply, in plain lettering that didn't try to compete with the marble around it. The strongest person in the room is often the quietest one, because they're the only one still checking their work. Listen to them before you need to. Underneath it, in smaller letters, was something Victoria had added without telling anyone until the small, private unveiling. A framed copy of a child's drawing, carefully preserved behind glass. 2 figures holding hands beside a tall building, under a sun with a smiling, lopsided face. James found it there on the day it went up, stood in front of it for a long, quiet moment with his hand resting lightly against the glass, and for the first time in 3 years, felt like the distance between who he used to be and who he was now had finally, quietly, closed completely. Behind him, Lily tugged at his sleeve, hard hat still slightly too big, sliding down over one eyebrow. Dad, is it my turn to check the next building yet? James smiled, the real one, the one that only ever came out at home, now standing in the middle of a lobby that had almost cost 200 people their lives, and that now, because one quiet man had refused to stop being honest even when it cost him everything the first time, would outlast every single person who had ever doubted him. Give it about 20 years, kiddo, he said, laughing softly for what felt like the first time in a long while. But yeah, it could absolutely be.